Right. I love these fantastic presentations, comments in the chat roll. Absolutely. Such a rich array of knowledge and partnerships that we're sharing here. So Emily put a link to the evaluation in the chat roll. We do want to invite you to, feel free to pull that up and keep filling it out. It helps us tremendously to get your feedback as we move forward. So that is like gold to us. It might not seem like gold to you, but to us as facilitators, it's like gold. So really appreciate folks filling that out. At the same time, if you have any questions or resources that you want to share with other people, feel free to add that in that chat roll as well. If you're hiring, if you have a webinar coming up, if you want someone else to know about a resource, or if you've just joined, feel free to add your name affiliation to the chat roll. Community member is a welcome affiliation. In just a moment, Shireen is going to be introducing our next panel, but we're going to give folks just a few more seconds. For those that have just joined, if you haven't heard the welcome yet, we're glad you're here. Welcome to the Living Shoreline Summit. And Sierra is going to go ahead and pull up our intro slide for our next panel. And Shireen, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our next panel. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you so much. So our next panel, we had a mission to prioritize living shorelines in high-risk communities or communities in high-risk areas. But we could also be thinking about high-risk communities. And as we kind of observed from one of the projects that we did, engaging the community, listening to community members, understanding, building relationships, understanding where they're coming from is really important. And then identifying which are the high-risk communities and how can we deliver these living shoreline opportunities for in an equitable way is really important. So our next two presenters are going to be covering first a perspective from inside our collaborative in the James River Watershed, and then one from Joe Rieger, and then Bhaskar with Maryland Department of Natural Resources will be sharing his expertise and experiences. So we're really looking forward to hearing tools that Elizabeth River Project has been working on and their work, and then from Bhaskar. So Joe, if you could share your presentation, that would be great.
Thanks, Shireen. Can you see my screen?
You can, but you're still in notes mode. So if you hit full screen mode, we'll be able to see the full screen. And it looks like it's in presenter mode still. There we go. It's like you're good to go.
All right. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the past of what ERP has been doing in underserved communities and kind of where we're heading in the future. Little background, if you don't know about us, we're a nonprofit working to restore the Elizabeth River to the highest practical level of environmental quality, working with government and businesses and community partners. We have about 2,000 members. We work with facilities, so businesses along the river, about 136 participating, and then over 500 River Star homes who we do restoration projects. Either in their backyard or in their front yard, or them making behavior changes. So one of the kind of the large project that we worked with in the past, and a lot of these projects I'm mentioning, just talking about, is the way we find these projects is we look at where the high levels of contamination is, for example, here at Money Point. And so that leads us to the community to work in. What I'm going to talk about in a second is how we can be more proactive in working in underserved neighborhoods by using the data that we have in hand to make choices on which neighborhoods we may want to work in. And so this is an example where old creosote facility caught on fire many years ago, lots of legacy pollutants, dead zone in the bottom of the river. It's adjacent to the South Norfolk and Portlock community in Chesapeake. And the community came together and came up with, actually Christine was part of this with the facilitation, is we brought the community together to come up with a overall plan for the community and the cleanup. We use the collective impact model to get these partnerships generated, and ideas that we ask the community, what would you like to see happen in the community? What are areas you like to improve? What are areas that you think need that are assets to the community? And so we developed an overall plan, and the plan was a community plan on how to address contamination, improve the overall amenities throughout Money Point. At the end of the day, we ended up as one of the many projects. We removed a significant amount of contamination from the site. Over 39 pounds of contaminated PAH material came out. We saw the return of about 26 fish species at the site. And the level of cancer in the fish dropped from 40% to 6% in less than 2 years. The idea, just kind of some of the construction and outcomes of that. A second project along the southern branch in Portsmouth was adjacent to the Craddock community and Truxton community. Again, primarily African American communities that were surrounded by up to about 3 or 4 Superfund sites. We did a plan years and years ago, and we're still carrying out that plan on how to overall restore that watershed. And one of the big things that the community was interested in doing is developing an open area and park. So we worked with the Port Authority and acquired 40 acres of land, worked with the Port Authority to build this 10-acre marsh at the site. And it's now an open space for the Craddock community and the Truxton's community, which use this. There's significant usage from both communities in and out, and along with the programming that we carry out at the park. So those are just 2 examples. There's a number of other ones I won't go into, but those are all where there was major Superfund sites. We felt that they should be addressed. Money Point, contamination on the river. So when we started looking at our new watershed action plan development, which is our blueprint for what we're going to do over the next 5 to 10 years, we asked the question, is there a way that we can take all this data that's been developed through EPA's environmental justice tool, along with, and wrap that in with local information, so we can have a tool that is more specific to the watershed, so that we can look at what communities have environmental or demographically vulnerable communities, and we can identify those and then talk with those communities to see if there was interest in partnering with us to do projects. And so we worked with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, Dr. Molly Mitchell, in helping to develop this tool. So at the bottom, you can access this tool and go on. It's a live tool, and it has a dashboard and also a mapping viewer. And so we typically use the mapping viewer because then you can have overlays of different different layers that might be of interest to you. So this is an example of how it can be used. So in the EPA EJ tool, environmental justice tool, they have a screening for environmental vulnerability and also demographically vulnerable communities. So what VIMS actually came up with is really interesting, is that you can combine these and then kind of map out communities that have high environmental and high demographic vulnerability. So here, if you look at this light green that pops out, those areas are the areas that there's in each one. I'm not going into what's in each one of these the environmental and demographic scores, but there's like 11 different elements that go into each one of these to determine separate elements to determine if you qualify, if you are in a high environmental vulnerable area or a demographic area. And you can go on the EPA website to see that. But the way it maps out is what you see here in the watershed, where you can see a lot of the areas where you would anticipate have these vulnerabilities are popping out in the data that EPA has collected. So then what we ended up doing with VIMS is looking at things like this. Can you combine those? So here is the same vulnerability data, but then overlaid with living shoreline potential. The living shoreline potential information is from the shoreline management tool that the Center for Coastal Research Management at VIMS developed. So then you can start to drill down into looking at what opportunities might be available in some of these communities. And then what you can then do is say, even beyond living shorelines, is you can start looking at other habitats. So here you can start looking at tree canopy. So the darker the green areas that you see, that's the tree canopy. But then that lighter green overlay that I just mentioned, those are the communities that I had just talked about. You can start seeing that a lot of those communities do not have significant numbers of percentage of tree canopy. And so we've been working specifically with Norfolk to kind of focus our efforts with our tree programs in some of these neighborhoods, and also work with the city on offering programs in the neighborhoods for folks to plant trees. And you can see a lot of this, and it's not surprising that a lot of these, the combined demographic and environmental vulnerable communities are the ones that were redlined back in the 1940s. And those overlays, when you actually look at tree canopy, it's very low percentage tree canopy in those neighborhoods also. So through our watershed action planning, we can then start to pull out certain communities that may have interest in working on entry, like tree canopy or living shoreline work. Here's an example of some of the work that Casey Shaw on our staff has been doing to look at neighborhoods across the watershed that we may want to focus more tree canopy work in. You can also overlay in this looking at the impacts from sea level rise, different scenarios across the watershed, and start looking at what neighborhoods will have the largest impact over time with sea level rise. And so the idea here is that this tool, we can be more proactive and working in our community instead of always going to communities that we know that there's a contamination issue. We can look at a number of factors across the watershed and make a specific decision of what we want to work on and where we want to work. And with that, that's all I have.
Thank you, Joe. Before we move on, I just wanted to say that we're really grateful for Bhaskar for showing up and helping us at the last minute. Warren Taylor from the Pamunkey tribe was, and excuse my mispronunciation, Pamunkey tribe, is sick today. So, and he couldn't come. So we're looking forward to hearing Marilyn's experience and Bhaskar's experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Thank you for asking me to talk about this topic, which is, very, very dear to my heart. So I've been doing shoreline projects for 15 plus years. And, in Maryland, I don't have an impressive slide deck that like Joe had. So I'm just going to be talking. I have maybe one slide later on. So Maryland historically has, so we have about 7,000 miles of shoreline. And if you look at it, in Maryland Department of Natural Resources historically engaged with all communities, waterfront communities, communities at risk, and one of the things that we're doing, so there are 3 work groups that I'm actually a part of, which I thought I'll just share that information with you. One of them is a work group that's out of the Bay program. It's called TOGI, which is basically, this work group is focused exclusively on targeted outreach for green infrastructure project in vulnerable areas. So what this group has done is we picked one area, one community in Pennsylvania, one in Maryland, one in Virginia. And we're working with that community to see how we can promote green infrastructure projects. Green infrastructure projects are basically ecological restoration project with a lot of green touch to it. We're not trying to build the next Great Wall of China or in Maryland or any place in the Chesapeake Bay. So most of these solutions that we're trying to look for are green approaches. And we also want to focus on the present and future rather than the past, in the sense that we would like to actually, deal with the problems of tomorrow rather than the problems of yesterday. So that kind of forward thinking is basically the focus that Maryland has had for a long time. The second group is called Envision the Chalk Tank. So Chalk Tank Watershed is one out of two watershed that NOAA has actually identified as significant in the country. So the Envision the Chalk Tank, that group, we're trying to actually work with, and there are different work groups as part of this initiative. Thank you so much for putting that, Christine, the link. So the Envision the Chalk Tank is basically what we're trying to do. One of the work groups is what is called, serving underrepresented communities. So as part of that, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I went to a town called Jonestown. It's in Caroline County, and it's not coastal. It's an inland community, and it's an predominantly African American community. We're trying to actually see how we could, how DNR with its partners can actually work to make this community more resilient to the future, impacts. The third one is an effort by DNR along with two other partners, the Coastal States Organization and another nonprofit called the National Wildlife Federation. The three organizations, we partnered up, and so we're trying to actually work on green infrastructure projects. And this term is something that I really, really appreciate if people could spread the term, this term that I'm going to tell you right now. And that the term is called frontline communities. Earlier you've heard from me, underrepresented, underprivileged, disadvantaged, all of these terminologies have a negative connotation to it. We've worked with a lot of these communities, and we've tested so many different terminologies that they're comfortable with. And the frontline community is something that is positive and actually tells you, what it actually means. These communities are indeed in the front lines when you can consider, flooding, sea level rise, and climate change, and all of those things, with little or no, a lot of investment that can actually, help them protect. So two things I know my time is already almost up, right, Shireen? So two things I wanted to actually leave this group with. One is the word frontline communities instead of, English is my second language, but I still think frontline is a lot more positive than the disadvantage and all of those things. And I've actually tried it with a lot of different communities, and they kind of prefer being called frontline communities. The second thing is, we've all heard of the DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. I want you to think slightly differently, and if you just reorder those letters in the acronym, the acronym that I use is JEDI, JEDI, which is basically, I use it for two reasons. One is, if you take all of these communities, one of the first things that these communities are looking for is justice. So I like this because, for one reason, is because justice is the first letter in that acronym. And the second thing, of course, Matt, you're absolutely right. I am a huge Star Wars buff, so for that reason also Jedi. So may the force be with you.
Thank you so much. That's, words do matter, and the terms we use to speak with people and engage them and share and make everyone feel comfortable and welcome is really important. And I think we could all learn from that. So that was very helpful to me in particular. And we've done a lot of work with Joe. Wetlands Watch has done a lot of work with Joe. Going to community meetings and meeting the people and asking them first what they need And so I also think the lesson that you just shared was we go out to the communities, we talk to the communities, we ask them how they feel, you know, not just come in full force with our own goals and objectives, because I mean, one community we worked with, they wanted waterfront access because they fish from the river. That's where they get most of their protein. Not so much the resiliency aspect, they just wanted their waterfront access. So
and Sharon, you're absolutely right. One thing that, like I said, I've been doing this for quite some time. I can give you one example, very quick example. And I was once invited to Mobile Bay, Alabama, and they were trying to do a living shoreline project in an area that was predominantly Creole population. And this NEP National Historian Program was trying so hard to actually do a really good project, in this neighborhood, and they were getting a lot of resistance. And one of the biggest reasons was they came in and they tried to actually put this project on the ground without asking the community, what is it that they value? What is it that they want to see in their backyard? And what is the plan? Even the best intentions, if it is not communicated, could actually end up being a really, really bad, a step. So I was called in. I went to this community from Maryland. I go in there with my accented English, and I go in there, and everybody understood me very clear. Because one thing I did was I asked them, and I told them, hey, I'm not trying to actually change anything in here. I'm just trying to share some examples from the North. And that's basically it. It was just a conversation. Let's talk. And whatever they were actually telling me, I was actually giving them examples. And I have a lot of pictures on my computer, so I was able to actually pull them up and say, this is how it looks. One site looked in Maryland, and this is what we did. And so they were like, oh yeah, your examples slides. I relate with this park actually had this big, very similar looking shoreline. So, okay, so this is what is possible. Tell me more. So when they ask that question, then I'm able to have a conversation with them and try to actually share an experience. So no agenda, just putting it out there as information.
So key. Absolutely listening first, understanding what the lived experiences of communities, not coming in with an agenda or an idea from the outside to parachute in and say, here's how to save your community, because that's the best way to shut people out across the board. So some really great feedback and lessons learned, and just listening first, which is what we're going to have a chance to do with each other in breakout groups. In just a few minutes, we're going to be just leaning into what sometimes can be uncomfortable conversations and just in a listening and learning mode from each other. First, though, we have a couple questions. Tabea has asked, Joe, this question is for you. Once the Elizabeth River Project has identified target locations, how is the information relayed to those target communities and partnerships initiated? What are the immediate next steps taken?
So what we've typically done is, as Shireen said, we determine if there were like a couple communities that we think would be good communities to work in, and then talk with the leadership, either through the Civic League or other community leaders. One thing that we have found is, a lot of communities, or a lot of the African American communities that we work in, are close to their council members, and so that's another way that builds trust, is to go with the council person. And the first thing is spending, at least the first 3-4 months just building trust, because, as an outsider coming in, especially, being white, it's very difficult. A lot of, like you said, a lot of groups come into these communities, they promise a lot, and then they leave. And the work we did with Wetlands Watch and a number of these communities, it took time to build the trust, but then at that point, we came in and said, what are your assets? Map them out. And the community, I think, it was amazing to see them go through and list all the things they love about their community. And then the next thing is, where are the problem areas? And they map those areas out. And then we have a discussion about how and ways to address those problem areas or enhance the areas that that the community feels are important. So that's like the first step that we typically take. And then we slowly wrap a plan around improving those items that the community's identified. And at the end, you want to walk away with the community supporting the plan, because so many times I know we've seen other groups put together plans, and then you get to the, I think Bhaskar was mentioning it, you get to the end to get ready to implement it, and then you hit a roadblock, and all it takes is one or two people yelling loud enough, and your effort's wasted. So our lens of what we think is important is not what the community that you're going into thinks is important, almost always.
Great point. And how to find out what that is without listening first. Aaron shared some great resources in the chat roll across the board, including a Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan. So some great feedback there. Additional questions for folks, feel free to unmute and ask questions. Or Bhaskar, anything else you want to add to what Joe just shared, or Marilyn's perspective on that question as well? But you're on mute.
So sorry. So one thing I wanted to actually share, and again, not something slightly different than what Joe mentioned, is we have a program called Resiliency through Restoration. It's an initiative that the governor actually passed in 2017. So one of the things is through this program is Maryland's effort to invest in natural resources, in the wetlands, in living shorelines, in dunes, and all of those natural resources is what we think is going to actually make our communities more resilient. We work with a lot of different folks on this, and there's one group that we actually worked on. I'm going to really quickly share a screen. It's going to be very, very quick. And that is, hold on, sorry. Are you able to see this?
You can. It's in not in presenter mode quite yet. Okay,
so sorry. And so what this is actually, NSF, National Science Foundation, actually did a study, and the group was called Sustainable Adaptive Gradients in the Coastal Environment. And so they came up with a list of gradients that could actually help with coming up with the right project. So what we did was we took those gradients and we gave a slight twist to it, the DNR touch. So if you look at it, so these 8 gradients were used to actually pick up good projects. So what we're doing is for the Resilience Through Restoration Initiative, we are using these gradients to actually come up with the best portfolio, a project portfolio, so to speak. And I want to actually draw your attention to the last one, the social benefits, where we basically took the social benefits gradient and then made it a social benefits and equity, where basically we divided that into social benefits, underserved community and access, and cultural preservation. And a project would actually be classified low, medium, or high based on these criteria to actually come up with. So we'd like to actually get projects that are serving the frontline communities. So that's, I thought I should just quickly share that.
Yeah, great resource. Thank you, Bhaskar. Yeah. All right, well, let's thank Joe and Bhaskar for their comments. Appreciate it. Joe put Yosef. I don't know, Joe, my family on my dad's side is Hungarian. So when I see that Yosef, I want to say the way my dad and my brother and my grandfather is Yosef. So it's hard for me to not pronounce it Yosef when I see that. So thanks, everyone. All right, so we're going to move into, I'm going to give you just a preview for a second of what our panel is after our breakout. So you definitely want to see this. Shireen is going to introduce this panel in just a little bit. But just so you know what's coming up after our breakout groups and after a break, Living Shoreline Leaders in Virginia and beyond. We have Ken, Robin, Ian, and Bhaskar coming up. But before that, we're going to move into breakout groups for about 25 minutes. And we have breakout groups of about 5 to 6 people each, and just very informal conversation for these breakout groups. what we're going to ask you to consider is, how have you engaged communities in high-risk areas? Or we can, jump in and say, how have you engaged frontline communities, with the wisdom from Bhaskar leading? Have you done this at all? You might not have experience, and that's very much welcome. How did it go? What were the lessons learned or ways to work differently in the future? If you don't have experience working in different communities so far, then we just invite you to listen to what other folks share, ask questions. What we found in a number of different groups is people are really in a shared listening and learning mode, and folks often just need to have a chance to say, well, what are you working on? How did it go? I'll speak for myself. I'm going to get it wrong at some point because I'm learning how to listen to how it makes sense. So we invite you to lean into uncomfortable conversations respectfully, about 25 minutes in the small group, and then bring some top ideas back to the chat roll. We have a group of facilitators who are going to be facilitating the small groups. So if you are with Karen During, Shireen Hughes, Emily Hinson, Ryan Walsh, Amber Ellis, Sierra Gladfelter, Emily Carlson, or Leah Taylor, myself, you will be in a facilitated small group. If one of those people aren't with you, you will get to facilitate your own small group. So if you don't have a facilitator, find one in your small group, and we'll put these questions in the chat roll. Sierra, how many groups don't have facilitators? Sierra's setting up our...
Yeah, I was just going to pop it in the chat. Groups 9 and 10 will not have facilitators. And if you're in group 1, you'll be staying here in the main room.
Great. So if group 1 will be staying here in the main room with Leah and I'll still be running tech. So Leah will run the group if need be. So groups 9 and 10, find a facilitator. We'll put those questions in the chat roll. So again, how have you engaged communities in high-risk areas, or have you? How did it go? Or the lessons learned or ways to work differently in the future. We'll have 25 minutes. We'll come back at 3:25 to share ideas in the chat roll. And then at 3:30, we'll have a 5-minute stretch break again before we come back at 3:35. Any questions from anyone? Let's see. You'll see in just a moment, someone just asked which group you're in. We'll open the rooms up in just a moment. Emily, before we do that, can you put your cell phone number in the chat roll, please? If you get stuck in your breakout rooms and you need someone to actually physically come over to your breakout room, then text Emily and one of us will come over to your breakout room to help you out. And you might want to jot her number down there. And Emily's popping it in the chat roll, but I'm going to go ahead and Emily, can you come off mute and just say it out loud as well?
Oh, sure. Hi. If you have any tech issues, you can text me. It's area code 570-506-1207.
Great. Thanks, Emily. All right. So we'll go ahead and open up the breakout rooms and we'll see everyone back at 3:25. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And we'll see you in just a little bit. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. How were your conversations? Did you have enough time for everybody to share ideas? Okay, great. Glad to see everybody. I see a few new faces. Welcome. If you just joined, feel free to share your name and affiliation to the chat roll, as well as Jedi is much better than DEIJ. Thanks for that, Shireen, emphasis. So feel free to start sharing some top ideas, questions, brilliant ideas, uncomfortable feedback, best practices around the questions. If folks didn't hear, I'm sure most of you had, how do you engage frontline communities, as Bhaskar said, or communities in high-risk areas? How have you done this? How did it go? What were the lessons learned or ways to work differently in the future? Would anybody like to unmute themselves and share your ideas as some more ideas are coming in the chat roll? Great. When you start out on a project, listen and bring a trusted member of the community. Absolutely develop a plan that is the community's plan and not an outsider's plan. Echoes a lot of what we hear across the board.
One thing we talked about, Christine, that was very interesting was this idea of different life experiences and perspectives, that everybody's got different life experiences that influences how they engage with other people with different life experiences. And sometimes that's a strength by having different perspectives, and just being willing to listen to each other can be really helpful.
I love that. Karen, did your group say at all about how people can have a sense of what that grounding looks like of the different lived experiences when starting to work together? Were there any inspiration points on how to do that learning at the beginning or onset of a project or effort?
Trust building, just like you said. is just sort of getting to know each other through showing up on time and building trust. Being in a place where you all have something in common. We had some master gardeners and they find it easy to engage with people at the farmers markets because everybody's there for a common purpose. So finding those times and places where everybody's there for a common purpose raises the comfort level and ability and willingness to listen to each other.
Yeah, great. So well said. Thanks, Karen. How about from others? Would anybody else like to unmute, including folks we haven't heard from yet today?
Something my group brought up, sometimes the community doesn't want or doesn't really need a restoration project, or they may have really legitimate concerns with an aspect of it. And, that's fine. That's okay. Like, it's their home. You need to listen to them. You need to, internalize their concerns.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Ryan. Really great things in the chat roll here. Opportunities about the districts and how others can restructure the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program and other programs to allow more access to funding, building relationships and trust, solving community problems, thinking long-term, but relationships and trust. And of course, that takes time and creative ways to do that in the era of virtual gathering or outdoor gathering. Anybody else want to come off mute and share any other reflection points?
I was thinking one of the things that we talked about in our group, which had Barbara in it, was long-term relationships and continued relationships. So after the dust settles, don't just take off.
Totally.
How can you continue to support that community? So we've thought about for the Chesterfield Heights community, they're in a construction zone and a lot of turmoil. And after the dust settles, how do we rebuild those relationships? But then also, how do we maybe engage the community so that we can provide some jobs within the community for maintaining the practices, the living shorelines, the green infrastructure after all the dust settles? So some workforce development.
Absolutely. We're going to get ready to wrap. I had a really great conversation with Lorian Farrell of the Resilient Cities Network last week. And Lorian is amazing. If you haven't had a chance to talk with her, she used to work with the Rockefeller 100 Cities Initiative, and she talked about paying community members consultant rates when you engage them on projects. So it's often a best practice to, pay people, if you're asking community members to come, to pay them. Certainly having food and often childcare or increasingly elder care is a best practice for engaging folks, but building into grants you're writing or a budget consultant rates for folks, really valuing their time. And I just thought it was a really brilliant, just something we need to say and share and learn from each other. So I want to invite folks, there's really great feedback coming in here in the chat. And this is a place where the collaborative is continuing to lean in and learn, but we've heard it's an important area. But isn't cost typical for lower shorelines and more traditional approaches? Absolutely. So that can vary depending on what the application might be and whether that's a listening or learning mode. There's so much to consider here in different ways. So we invite you to continue these conversations as they balloon out. We are going to take a couple-minute break. We're really looking forward to our last session. So thanks again to Joe and Bhaskar and all our facilitators. So let's thank everybody for that last session. Really appreciate everyone's time. You can find the reactions button or clap if you want. We have time for a 3 or 4 minute break. Emily, will you go ahead and put the evaluation link in the chat roll again, please? So I want to draw your attention to the evaluation, which is really helpful for us. And I'm also going to put a link in the chat roll to a tool that we're going to be using after the next session. It's an online place to share ideas called Social Pinpoint. If you click on the left-hand side, there's an About button. You can look on how to add ideas, but people have already started sharing ideas around 6 different topic areas. We'll introduce it and let you know how to use it later, but if you're itching to jump into something, feel free to check out, hover over the I About button in the top left under Social Pinpoint, and you'll see more. So we have about a 3-minute break. We'll come back at 3:35. We'll leave the chat room open in case you want to visit with folks. And thanks everyone again. We'll see you at 3:35 for our next and last panel of the day. Thanks everyone.